All right, we are now live. Um, we're going to give it a few minutes for everyone to make their way into today's webinar, but if you're joining us, welcome. Heather, thank you so much for being with us. How is your Wednesday going?
It's going great, thank you, and thank you for having me once again. These are always fun.
Yes, absolutely. We really appreciate it. And for folks who are just joining us, you can find some of the other webinars we've done with Heather over the years. We did one in April on compliance policies, so how you sort of tailor your approach to licensing for, the differences between, for example, embedded software and SaaS and things of that nature. We also did one previously on license compliance tools, and then one on everyone's favorite subject, license notices. Uh, so you can find those if you go to our page on Bright Talk and scroll through some of the on-demand recordings. But we're just going to give it another minute or so for folks to make their way in. If you're joining us, really appreciate you taking time out of your Wednesday to be here, and we'll get started shortly. All right, we're just going to give it another few seconds, and then we'll get started. Uh, but yeah, okay, let's get started. Like I said, really excited that you've joined us for this webinar, When Open Source Isn't Open Source, featuring Heather Meeker, who is a software licensing specialist, leading IP attorney, and really the authority in all things open source licensing, source available licensing, dual licensing. So we're really excited that we have her here today. My name is Andy Drukarev. I'm on the team at FOSSA. I'll be your host for today's webinar. Before I go over our agenda and hand things over to Heather, a few housekeeping notes. First, we'll do our best to answer any questions you have as you submit them. And then we'll also have some time at the end for a dedicated Q&A. So please do post your questions in the questions section of your Bright Talk console. Next, this webinar is being recorded. It will be sent out to you after the event, along with a link to the slide deck. Finally, we at FOSSA will be following up with you as well with those links and a few additional resources to see if there's anything we can do to help your organization with license compliance. Now, let's take a look at our agenda. So we're going to start with a bit of a high-level overview of some of the differences between the licensing models that are going to be discussed in today's webinar. So open source, proprietary source, source available. Then we're going to dive deep into source available licensing models and dual licensing models, including some examples of each, some of the concerns, the IP concerns that these models can pose, and strategies for managing them. And then we're going to conclude with a look at kind of the role of tooling in managing these models and how they can potentially impact audits and compliance. Now, before I turn things over to Heather, a few words for folks who are not familiar with FOSSA. So we provide technology that helps organizations manage open source and software licensing. So businesses use our products to identify and comply with open source software licenses. And that would include, it doesn't include, but in addition to source available licenses, and then we also support other areas related to using open source safely, like vulnerability management and software bill of materials. So with that, super excited to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Heather Meeker. I suspect many of you on this webinar may be familiar with Heather, but if you aren't, she is one of the lawyers who has really shaped software licensing and open source license compliance as we know it. She's authored the go-to book on the subject, as well as a new book, which is all about commercial open source software and kind of business models around it. And I know, Heather, you'll say a few more words about that book during this webinar. And she's worked with numerous companies on compliance-related matters, including FOSSA, where she's helped advise us on certain product-related matters. So with that, I'll turn things over to you, Heather, and wondering if you might start by sharing a bit more about kind of your background and current projects.
Oh, sure. Thanks very much, Andy. And thanks to FOSSA for sponsoring this webinar. Yeah, so I've been involved with software for a long time, really an embarrassingly long time. I was a coder at one point. It was a really long time ago, but I maintained my interest in that for the years as I went through a law career and moved also into the venture capital role. Let's see, my latest projects, I've always got too many projects, I'm doing a YouTube video series now called Heather Thinks About Software. And it's really on various topics, not just licensing, but it's presented in a way that's supposed to be kind of accessible to people who aren't immersed in software licensing. And it's about various legal and business topics in the technology world. I have a product called FOSSA, which, sorry, it shouldn't be confused with FOSSA, but it's an oral history of the open source movement. And so that's kind of a labor of love for me. And then also working on the attempts to define open source AI. There are a couple of parallel projects I'm working on, one of which is called Open Weights and one is the OSI project. So that's what I'm up to lately, in addition to pushing my book out the door, which I finally did.
Awesome. Sounds like a very busy schedule, but with some really cool and relevant and impactful initiatives. So to kick us off, and apologies for the formatting issues you're seeing here with the very different size bullets. Our webinar platform does that from time to time. But Heather, wondering if you could give us kind of the lay of the land when it comes to these different software licensing models. I think you hear a lot about open source, then commercial, proprietary source, and you could just sort of explain what some of the key differences are.
Sure. Well, when you use the term open source, there's a kind of generic way to use that term, and then there's a more precise way to use the term. And I would say mostly for people who are not lawyers or not focused on licensing, the idea of open source is very broad. But it's actually important what the precise definition is, because it has a lot of implications for the kinds of issues that we're going to talk about today. So lots of people use the term open source to mean just something where source code is available to people, or they even use it to refer to software that's free of charge. And that can get confusing because when we set compliance rules for open source licenses, we're really relying on them being sort of the true definition of open source. And if we can't rely on that definition, then we have to introduce some more complexity into compliance requirements. So that's why, it's not merely pedantry to talk about the precise definition of open source. It actually makes a difference to how you manage open source compliance day to day. So let's talk about the precise definition. And you can look at the open source definition, which is managed by the Open Source Initiative, or the free software definition, which is done by Free Software Foundation. In substance, they're actually pretty similar. But the one fundamental concept about open source, other than source code availability, of course, is that it allows the software to be freely used for any purpose. It grants all the rights of copyright, and it doesn't impose any restrictions on the use of the software. It can impose conditions. Lots of people get confused about the difference, but a condition is, if you do this thing, you have to do this other thing. Like, for instance, if you drive a car, you have to get a license, but you don't have to get a license if you're not going to drive your car. So it can have conditions, and licenses like GPL impose significant conditions. Permissive licenses impose hardly any conditions at all. But to be open source, the most important overarching quality is no license restrictions, no field restrictions, no market restrictions, no territory restrictions, and so forth. As a contrast, proprietary licenses impose limitations. And the kind of old style way of doing this is to impose limitations on number of servers or number of users. In the old days, we used to do site licenses, CPU licenses, but that's mostly gone by the wayside. The point is that if you're licensed for 100 users and you use a software for 200 users, those extra 100 users are actually not licensed. And so you've actually violated the license and have potentially engaged in copyright infringement by exceeding the license restrictions. And proprietary licenses have all sorts of restrictions. Once you get out of the open source or the pure open source realm, it can be anything. It can say you can only use this for testing purposes. You can only use it with 100 users. You can only use it with these specific products. Or you have to have a bundling requirement, like you can't sell it on a standalone basis. Those are the kinds of limitations that proprietary licenses impose. Recently, we've seen a very strong tendency for companies who are releasing open source or software to instead move into a new category, which is kind of a combination of the two, called source available. By the way, there's no real definition of source available. It's just kind of what people call this category. And I would say it's become extremely popular in the last 5 years or so. And that is a new kind of license that has the quality that it makes source code available, but it imposes some license restrictions. And when we talk about source available today, that's what we mean. It's deployed like an open source license, and it might, and people might mistakenly refer to it as an open source license, but it's really not the same thing because it has a license restriction. We'll talk a little bit more as we go along about what those restrictions might be.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, no, that's a great overview, and I think a great segue also into this deeper dive into source available licensing models, and the fact that it does have some properties in common with both some of the traditional proprietary source and open source licenses, and wondering if you could sort of talk us through in a bit more detail what some of the key differentiators are between source available and some of these other licensing models.
Yeah, so as I foreshadowed on the last slide, it always means that the source code is available. That's the most important overarching thing, and that's what causes people to refer to these colloquially as open source, because they have access to the source code. But the license is not unrestricted, and it has what licensing lawyers would call a field of use limitation. It can also be number of users or something like that too, but it's usually a field of use limitation. A field of use limitation is an old term in IP licensing, and it can refer to, say, a technology area, a market, a geography, or a kind of use. The thing about source available licenses that makes them look a lot like open source licenses is that they're implemented in what I would call a frictionless manner. So if you look at if it's fair to call anything in the software world traditional, at a traditional license, like an end user license, you have to click to accept it. And There are legal underpinnings for why that's a best practice in end user licensing. Source available doesn't have an acceptance mechanism, at least it very rarely does. So it's implemented like open source licenses, meaning you usually download the software and there's a license included in the software. Same way you would find out what the license was for open source software. So you usually don't have to click to accept anything, but the license grants broad enough rights so that if you don't accept the terms and you reject them, then you wouldn't really have the right to do what you wanted to do with the software. That's the legal theory on which frictionless method rests. So just to recap, source available like open source, it makes source code available. Unlike open source, it has a license restriction, and like open source, it's deployed in a frictionless manner. So here are some examples of source available licenses that you might have heard of. The most popular one is the business source license, which was created by MariaDB. And it's been around for a long time. It's an unusual one because it includes this license change notice, license change feature or bug, depending on how you look at it. And so what it says is you can use the software for non-production uses, which, by the way, is not defined. And then it says automatically after a certain amount of time, maximum 4 years, the license changes to a GPL compatible open source license. So this is sometimes referred to as embargo or delayed open source. The business source license has gotten a lot of traction, particularly in the crypto area. And there's no particular reason why it was in the crypto area other than just it was adopted by some companies in that area. And so it, got a little bit of publicity and popularity. The thing is that the production use restriction is really kind of broad and not precise enough for most people. And so they tend to write what they call additional use grants. So with business source license, you're usually looking at the business source license itself and an additional use grant. And then it selects the change license, which can be, say, GPL or BSD, MIT, LGPL. And then it selects a change date. That's the most complicated one. And weirdly, it's the most common one. But that tells you something about how licensing works. Sometimes people adopt licenses because they've heard of them and maybe not because they're necessarily the easiest to understand or even the best one to use. There's the Elastic license. That was, of course, published by Elasticsearch. And that was sometimes referred to as an Amazon killer. I think that's a reductive way to look at it, but it says you can't use the software to provide a managed or hosted service. So this type of restriction is very popular in source available licenses because the companies that release software under these licenses are trying to protect their cloud business. The Elastic license allows redistribution freely. So it's not protecting the distribution business, only the cloud business. So that's a strategic decision. Elastic also has another restriction, which is that you can't disable the license key functionality because Elastic controls some of its paid features by putting them in the software, but having them not be turned on unless you paid for them. So I would say that like business source was predated a lot of these other licenses by quite a bit. Elastic is one of the more recent ones. And And then in between those two is Commons Clause. I would say Commons Clause ended up being more like a thought experiment than something that a lot of people use. It's actually a kind of an addendum to an open source license. And the fact that it was an addendum caused some consternation in the open source world. But it's like, here, this software is under Apache, but we're putting Commons Clause on it. And it basically says you can't sell the licensed software. So at a very high level, I would describe that as a non-commercial restriction, which is kind of more like business source license. So if you see Commons Clause, you'll see the base license plus the addition of Commons Clause. Polyform is a project that I worked on with some other lawyers who are in the open source space to create a kind of Creative Commons-like menu of choices for source available licenses. And so if you look at Polyform, you would see various choices like non-commercial, evaluation only, and even some that are kind of similar to elastic type of restriction. So these are some of the most common ones you'll see. And I'll reiterate, they're not open source licenses, but from a 50,000 foot view, they can kind of look like open source licenses. But when you see them in software with business source license, you're going to see the license plus some additional information, the change license, the change date, etc., and probably an additional use grant. With Elastic, you'll just see the license, just like you would with an open source license. With Commons Clause, you would see the base open source license plus Commons Clause. And with Polyform, you would, again, just see the base license because that's just one document. So let's talk about what you need to understand about source available in order to manage risk. A lot of the issues are very similar to open source licensing. With open source, you need to do security review. Well, you need to do that with any software that's in your product. But source available licenses have license notices requirements, which are very similar to open source licenses. By the way, we who draft these licenses try to make them easier to comply with than open source licenses, for instance, allowing you to put a URL rather than the whole license. But it's the same kind of process. If you redistribute a product that has one of these elements in it, you need to pass on a license notice. And the general need for a software bill of materials, of course, is not entirely about licensing. It's about a lot of things plus licensing. But the main issue is that with source available licenses, you need to make sure you can comply with the license restrictions. You would not have that issue with an open source license. So, for example, if a source available license says only non-production use, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to maintain that control within your organization. And a lot of organizations tell me, and I think this is right, that once you approve software for use within an organization, it gets very hard to control how it's used within the organization. Excuse me. If you look at the way this played out with proprietary software like end user licenses over the last 30 years, people developed software management tools that would go and make sure that you were only using the number of users or servers or whatever that you were allowed to use under the license. But no such thing really exists with something like a non-production use restriction. And so you have to do some human intervention to make sure you've got policies and processes in place to make sure that you continue to comply. It's easy for software to come into your organization and then have somebody, on a dev team say, oh, well, we're using this here. I can use it for this purpose too. And that might not be true. Just one moment. Okay, so the next thing is that source available licenses are not standardized. One of the things about open source in addition to the fact that it has no restrictions and, so it means you're free to use the software for whatever you want. That's a great benefit. Another great benefit is the actual, like, significant amount of standardization with open source licenses. So although there are hundreds of them, most of the software is under about 6 of them. And so it's very easy to make assumptions about what the license terms say and understand what the license terms say because there are actually so few of them that people use with any regularity. Source available licenses you have to review on an ad hoc basis, just like you would with a proprietary license. And then source available licenses are almost always implemented by private companies and usually in a dual licensing model or some other business model where the company wants to make money from the software. So for instance, if I'm a company and I release software under a source available license that says no commercial use, and you want to use it for commercial purposes, you have to come back to me and negotiate a separate custom license with me. That's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, if you want to use the software in a way that is not allowed by the license, then you can probably negotiate a license to do that because mostly the companies will negotiate terms. That's kind of easier than some open source licenses. For instance, if you find a big project under GPL and it's a community project and you want to use it under other terms, you would not be able to negotiate an alternative license. So the project cannot or will not usually provide alternative terms. On the other hand, the companies that release open source, that release source available code are usually doing some enforcement activity because they're shoring up their rights. And so you should expect that it's a little more common to have actual enforcement actions from private companies. By the way, those are not usually lawsuits. They're usually just letters saying, we understand that you're using this in violation of license. You need to get a license. Here's the fee for it. And you might be able to negotiate the fee, but as an overarching matter, if you can't live with the terms of a source available license, that's a problem you can solve with money. And that's always a double-edged sword. It's good to be able to solve problems. It might be painful to pay, but at least there is a solution.
Thanks, Heather. That was a wonderful overview. A few questions that came in about these. Will the slides be available? So we had several questions about that. The answer is yes. We will follow up with you after the webinar. We'll include a link to the slide deck as well as the on-demand recording. If you have additional questions, do please feel free to submit them. We will have time at the end for a Q&A, but we'll also try to get to as many as we can throughout the presentation. So at this point, we want to transition slightly from a discussion of source available into a discussion of dual licensing models, which is another one with some complexity, I know, Heather, and wondering if you could just sort of speak to this and explain what we need to know about dual licensing.
Sure. So first of all, dual licensing, it implies there are 2 different options. There might actually be more than 2 options, but I'm still going to refer to it as dual licensing. Some people call it multi-licensing. But it actually refers to a couple of different things, although one is much more common than the other. So it usually refers to a model when the company, it's usually a private company, offers a choice of licensing options. And it's usually a choice between an open source license and some kind of commercial license. But it can also mean a scenario where the software is under multiple licenses simultaneously. So the most famous example, a little bit of an anachronism, but if you've done open source diligence, you've probably seen this. OpenSSL, which is a very popular open source utility, security utility, was licensed under 2 slightly different permissive open source licenses, and they both applied at the same time. That is something that dual licensing can mean, but it's not as common. It's usually an or instead of an and that means you choose between the options. When you get information in a software audit about dual licenses, you actually need to understand whether it means or and. So if you get a license report and it says GPL MIT, that is usually going to mean that both licenses apply. If you get a licensing report and it says AGPL and commercial, that means it's usually a choice. And the only reason I know that is based on context. I've gone through lots of licensing audit reports, and often this is not terribly clear. And so it's important that you understand what the universe of choices can be so that when you get a single line item that has multiple licenses listed, you understand how to figure those out. And sometimes you have to go and just look at the information that's on the relevant website and figure it out. So you can have an and, or you can have an or. So let's move on to the next one. So dual licensing, as I mentioned, when I was talking about like source available, dual licensing options are usually private companies that release software under an open source license, almost always a Faro GPL, maybe GPL, but they will negotiate alternative licenses. So why is it almost always a Faro GPL or GPL? Because those are the copyleft licenses that impose the most conditions. And so they're going to have the effect of driving users who don't want to comply with those licenses towards negotiating alternative licensing. It makes almost no sense to offer a dual licensing product, a dual license product under something like Apache, because there's no reason anybody would pay for an alternative license for that. When companies do a dual licensing model, they almost always make those options clear on a public-facing website because they want people to know that there's an option to negotiate commercial licenses, and they want people to come to them. So companies that do that are well served by making the choices clear. And when I work with clients in my law practice who are doing dual licensing options, I strongly recommend that they make it as clear as possible, because that's how they're actually going, one way they're going to generate business for their companies. There's also something that is more like open core than dual licensing. They're similar, but not exactly the same. But you will see that a lot of companies have one edition, which is an open source edition, and one of which is a commercial or enterprise edition. And those are usually slightly different products. When we talk about dual licensing, like the original model for dual licensing, by the way, was MySQL was the pioneer of it. The code bases for the two options are identical, or at least are supposed to be identical. But over the years, this model has expanded to variations where there is different functionality in the different editions that are offered. So the pros about dual licensing is that there are often other licenses available, so you can solve compliance problems by negotiating a regular commercial license. The cons are that you can have additional compliance work, and a lot of the tracking tools that you use might not track dual licensing terribly well.
Thanks, Heather. No, another great rundown. We do have a number of questions, and I will try to get to several of them now. And if we don't get to your question now, we will do our best to get to it at the end of the presentation. One that I think is very interesting. In the case of and dual licensing, so if we go back to the previous slide, right, that means you're complying with both licenses. How are conflicting clauses reconciled?
That's a good question. I'm not sure it's always done correctly. And I'm not sure that it's always that the dual licenses are always applied thoughtfully. But here's how it should work. Um, Sometimes when you see two open source licenses on a project, it means that certain components are under one license and certain components are under another. I use the example of OpenSSL because actually, as I understand it, that code base was covered by two different licenses simultaneously. So what that meant was you had to comply with both for the entire thing. But sometimes it means that like pieces might be GPL and other pieces might be MIT. So there's not really a conflict. But if both licenses apply at once, you have to comply with the terms for both. And if they are open source licenses, they probably shouldn't exactly conflict because they're both going to grant unlimited rights. It's just that you have to comply with all of the conditions for each of the licenses.
Another question that I think sort of helps us establish some of the big picture context and make sure that we're all on the same page about different terminology. Um, so production use, commercial use, etc., are still rather vague terms. And I am not, and this is, I guess, from the perspective of an in-house counsel, and this person is not 100% approving those licenses within the organization, even if their use would likely qualify as non-production and non-commercial. The license FAQs often provide additional clarity with respect to the licensor's intent, but the FAQs aren't legally binding. It would be helpful to include those additional clarifications in the license itself. Is there a reason why it hasn't been done for the BSL and so on and so forth?
I can't really speak to why BSL didn't do any definition of non-production. That actually does make me as a licensee a little uncomfortable. But if you look at a term like production use, I would say that is production use is broader than commercial use. So, but what I'm doing is I'm drawing on my experience in not in open source licensing, but just in regular licensing. So I would say production use is anything on, say, live data that you're actually using, as opposed to experimental use or testing use, usually on, on test data. And that, lack of comfort is what spurs these additional use grants that people write for BSL. Non-commercial also can be ambiguous, and non-commercial on the one hand could be only use by non-commercial entities or only used by non-commercial entities for non-commercial purposes. And on the other end of the spectrum, it can be, say, anything that isn't directly monetized. By the way, if you look at the commentary in Creative Commons, which has a non-commercial version of one of its licenses, you'll see the kind of bid ask on this discussed a little bit. And one of the reasons people don't put this in the license is the main reason is they want to use a generic license. They don't want to write their own license, because if they put more specific definitions in the license, it would become its own license. And that happens with BSL in the additional use grants. But with other things like Elastic and Polyform non-commercial, people, they don't want to do too much violence to the base license, because part of what they're communicating to people is we're using a somewhat standardized license. I would, by the way, disagree that the FAQs are non-binding if they are published by the licensor, because from a legal point of view, they would probably be statements against interest. And so if I publish a licensing FAQ that says my software is licensed under Polyform non-commercial, and that means you can use it for anything that's not directly monetized, and then I try to sue you for that, I'm not going to win that argument, or I shouldn't win that argument at the end of the day. So there is a kind of a delicate balance between what you put in FAQs and what you put in the licenses. And yes, it would be more comfortable for the lawyers if everything were very detailed in the license, but then we would have no standardization at all.
A few more quick questions on dual licensing, and then we will move on to the next topic. But can GPL software be dual licensed with a commercial branch if contributions have been accepted into the GPL software?
That's a good question. Yes, but only if there's been the use of a contribution license agreement. So GPL software can be dual licensed if the licensor owns every line of code in the software, because the conditions for GPL only flow downstream. They don't apply to the original author or owner of the copyright in the software. But if you're running a project, say on GitHub, and you accept contributions and you don't say anything otherwise, then the contributions are going to be under GPL as well. And you would not be able to use those contributions in something in a license, a version that is licensed under a non-GPL compatible license, like a commercial license. So companies that do dual licensing have to use CLAs. There are some ways around that, but it's usually quite difficult. It depends on the specific facts of the product, but mostly commercial dual license products use contribution license agreements, which are broad inbound licenses.
How often do you encounter multi-licensing for the purpose of interoperability with different types of project code? For example, multiple graphical frameworks.
Yeah, I encounter that's one of the main reasons for multi-licensing, unless it's a commercial dual license. And by the way, it's kind of funny because people will actually release code and say, this is available under either GPL or MIT. And if you think about it, that is never necessary because MIT is actually compatible with GPL. So you could take MIT code and put it in a GPL project, and that's all you need to say. You don't need to say MIT plus GPL. But licensing decisions are not always made with perhaps the amount of thought that people should make them. Or sometimes I've heard people say, well, I know I don't really need to say GPL and MIT, but it'll just mean that people have fewer questions. To me, it's more questions. It doesn't make sense, but there is a thought that it means less questions. So yes, I definitely see projects that release under multiple licenses in order to ensure compatibility with other code with which the project should interoperate. And the most common type of choice you would get there is, say, GPL2 and Apache 2, because they are allegedly not compatible with each other. I don't agree, but a lot of people think so.
Excellent. We have other questions. We'll do our best to get to them toward the end, but wanted to shift gears slightly, Heather, to a discussion about how some of the tools that are available today, including FOSSA, can help manage some of the IP concerns and risks from these different licensing scenarios.
Sure. So the reason that we do license audits is to manage license risk. I mean, that's how most of the tools emerged. But there are issues that are not license issues, and there are also licenses that are not open source licenses. So the tools have expanded to address license risk, third-party software risk, I would say, and not simply open source licensing risk. Like the original idea of a lot of the tools on the market was open source licensing risk, and now you're seeing them expand to cover other things. My experience actually is that these days, when I'm working on an M&A deal and there's a real problem, it's it, it's actually the software that is not open source software that causes the most headaches. So, uh, the issue that most lawyers are most afraid of is there'll be GPL software in the product and it's going to infect the rest of my code and blah, blah, blah. And well, that is possible. It doesn't usually happen. And the reason it doesn't usually happen is that complying with GPL is not really that difficult if you are using standalone programs and you don't modify them. It's very hard to get sideways with GPL. And that is the primary use case for GPL software in any product. So, so the landscape is that GPL is mostly applied to standalone products, and the landscape is that most open source software is never modified. So that means that the big boogeyman, right, which is GPL taint and infection and viral effect and so forth, is not usually a problem. It's a possible problem, but you rarely find it. What you find a lot is problems that arise from dual licensing software. Things like Java and MySQL have historically been, they're both Oracle products. They are dual licensed and they that's probably, if I counted the significant issues that I've found in M&A deals over the last 10 years, they would represent a lot of them. And then also you'll find a lot of code in your code base that is under limited license, like say evaluation licenses. And even setting aside this idea of source available and everything, evaluation licenses have been around forever. And it's very common for developers to take code that they get under an evaluation license, they put it in a product while they're doing development, and then they just never upgrade to a production license. And, it's easy to understand why that happens, of course. But that's actually, kind of pound for pound, tends to be a bigger problem than open source compliance actually is. So to sum it all up, when you're using compliance software, you're usually not just using it on open source, you're using it on all third-party software elements, and you're not just using it for licenses, you're using it for license compliance, security review, bill of materials, and so forth.
Thanks, Heather. So we actually had a question that is a perfect transition into this slide, but it's, does FOSSA identify source available licenses in the list of dependencies? And the answer is yes. And what you're looking at now is a screenshot that sort of depicts this. For context, the way it works is that FOSSA, will automatically scan your code when you first import it. You can also run additional scans by setting up an automatic trigger or using a manual command. And so that when you run a scan, you get an inventory of your dependencies along with their licenses. And so here you see that there is this dependency under the business source license. The one other thing to call out here is that you see there's this little policy flag icon next to the dependency name. And the reason for that is that the way that our product works is that you can implement your compliance policies directly in our product. In other words, if you're okay with MIT, but not okay with GPL, you can let us know. And then moving forward, we will deny builds that have GPL and then, pass all checks if it has MIT, right? And then there's a kind of a third category where, you might want to flag a license for legal review, or it's not something that's in your policy, in which case it would also be flagged. And that's sort of the scenario that you see here, where, perhaps it is a source available that you're not seeing all the time, or there's a new open source license. And in this case, we're flagging it so that you can remediate appropriately internally. So we have a few more questions, but before we get to them, Heather, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk through what's, I think, a very relevant, timely, and exciting book that you've just published, From Project to Profit: How to Build a Business Around Your Open Source Project.
Thanks, Andy. I'll very briefly touch on this. This book just came out. Some of you have probably seen my previous book on open source software licensing called Open Source for Business. This is different. This is about using open source as a tool in a business model. So this is a book about business, and it tracks a lot of what I've been doing as a venture capitalist for the past 5 years or so. It's a short book, hopefully very accessibly read, and it's really directed at entrepreneurs and developers who are thinking about starting their own business around an open source project they're doing. So it's available on Amazon, and check it out if you think it might be interesting to you. By the way, Andy, I pinned a few of the questions that I thought were. Are you able to see that?
I am.
Okay,
yeah.
good.
We will get to them now. So the first question: what is your stance on shimming or other methods to sidestep GPL licensing in Linux kernel modules and other low-level code? You mentioned the notion of upstream, but is there real directionality in calling GPL code versus calling it?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of shimming. I would say that, and just to step back for a moment for people who might not be familiar with this term, I'll try to make this short. So the rules for GPL compliance are basically that that in a single program, you have to have either all GPL code or no GPL code. And you'll hear people talking about derivative works and intimate communication and all these kinds of issues. I would say that a lot of that is not terribly understandable, but it is pretty understandable whether something is one program or multiple programs, or at least that's something that we can tether to in the real world. So and this kind of issue tends to come up for companies who are doing what I would call like low-level development. Low-level doesn't mean, it's not smart. It means it's actually quite difficult. So for instance, if you're developing an application for Linux, you're not going to run into GPL problems. If you're developing a custom Linux system, that's when you get into GPL problems. Or if you're developing a hardware product and its driver needs to work with the Linux kernel, which is under GPL, that's when you potentially get into GPL problems. So one thing that companies have done over the years is try to take the position that if they put in a shim, which is like a wrapper of code around their proprietary code, and then the interface between the GPL code and the proprietary code takes place at the shim and not at the border of their proprietary code, that they can separate the licensing. My view is that that doesn't usually work terribly well. It's one of those solutions that kind of works on paper, but if you really want to irritate a GPL community, that's exactly the way to go about it. So I haven't recommended to a client to do that in 15 years, probably. Now, you can get into situations where defining what is one program versus two can be very complicated. And that's honestly, when I do projects like that, I also call in technical consultants to talk about it, because it can be a very difficult thing to figure out. So my view on shimming is that if your shim is under, say, an MIT license, which would be compatible with GPL, then it just moves the line over to where your proprietary code is. It doesn't really help the problem. What people should focus on is keeping proprietary code in proprietary programs and keeping GPL code in GPL programs. And if you do that, then you usually don't have too many issues with the GPL community you're dealing with.
A few more just quick ones. There's one question. Can we ask later after this presentation ends? If yes, where? We will be following up with you over email, and we'll include contact information, so you can reach out to us or Heather there. The next one, just very quickly, what type of software does Heather consider large language models, e.g., generative AI large language models?
I don't really consider them software. So AI is complicated. Large language models are models, and models are not really software. So actually, there's a lot of churn going on in the world right now about how these things should be licensed. And you actually see a lot of models, and people say this is an open source model, and it's just not true at all, right? There are models that are made available free of charge. There are a few models that are truly under licenses like Apache. I think I saw one the other day and tweeted about it. But most of them are not. And the thing is, there's no standardization in model licensing. When you have a large language model or machine learning model, you have a model, which is a bunch of weights, basically. And you probably have some software, which might be a user interface or training software. You're going to have model training definitions, which is kind of like documentation. You're going to have data. And all of those things are potentially should be under different kinds of licenses. I am not a fan of using software licenses for things that are not software. If you use a license like Apache or BSD, you can usually kind of get away with it because they're permissive and who cares, right? But if you use copyleft licenses, it almost immediately makes no sense. Like, what's a work based on the program for a model? Well, nobody knows the answer to that. There are no actual instructions. It's not source code. So I would say there's a lot of inconsistency out there right now. When people say models are open source, you have to really look and see what licenses they're using, because they might not be open source at all. OpenAI is not open. And also, if you're thinking about releasing a model, you need to think carefully about the different elements and what licenses they should be under.
Great. So I think we hopefully will have time for two more. The next one, do you encounter dual licensing where the licensor offers rights or restrictions in a preamble to an OSI, um, open source initiative approved license? How common is this scenario?
It's not common, and I'd say the most common example of that is something like Commons Clause. And that's just not something people use very much. It was kind of an elegant solution, but it caused a great deal of consternation in the open source community, and so it's not popular. And I don't see, maybe I've seen one or two examples of people trying to do that. But if someone came to me and said, I want to do an open source license and I'm going to put a preamble with a restriction, I would say, no, you should just write a source available license, or use an existing one, or use BSL, or something that's going to be more familiar to people, because that would be very confusing.
What happens when a given company creates its own, quote, great open source license? Which I think this is just like a placeholder name, right? They create a new open source license with open source in the license name, but the license contents destroy the points of open source definition as provided by the open source initiative. How should a potential user handle this?
Well, it's not terribly common for people to write their own open source licenses. If you do that, you're leaving behind one of the big benefits of open source, which is that the licenses are mostly standardized. But some people feel the need to write their own licenses. I won't say it's never a good idea. I've worked on a couple of open source licenses, but I would mostly say it's not a good idea, because as evidenced by the question, I think it causes a lot of confusion. And I would not recommend calling a license open source if it doesn't meet the open source definition. Now, there are some legitimate points of discussion about whether a license meets open source definition. An example of that would be SSPL, which Mongo did, a while ago, and it was actually submitted to Open Source Initiative and then withdrawn. There was a lot of controversy over whether it was really open source, but the objective there was that it was supposed to be open source. But a lot of thought went into that, and I would say that's on the margins of what somebody might do. It's a big effort to write an open source license. It's a very difficult drafting task. It shouldn't be done by people who aren't familiar with open source licensing, because there are issues in open source drafting that don't really come up in regular license drafting. So it's kind of one of those don't do this at home things. And as a company, you should be very circumspect about calling something open source. If it doesn't meet the open source definition, you're probably going to get a lot of flack over it.
Do we have time for one more? Sorry, I know we're at time, but
sure.
This was one I think it's a good one to end on, because it goes to kind of the heart of a large part of this presentation. Can you speak to how making software available under a source available license benefits the companies that make the software available?
Yeah, so it benefits it in two ways. It benefits it because of its openness and because of its lack of openness. So let's say I'm making a database. So this is very common, comes up in database sector all the time. And I have some code and I want to sell commercial licenses to it. My customers will not use that software unless I give them the source code. The reality today is that you have to give customers source code because they expect it. That's been one of the effects of the open source movement. 20 years ago, there were binary only licenses and escrows and stuff. That stuff is falling by the wayside now. The commercial expectation is that you give your customers source code so that they don't have worries about business continuity. So you have to have a source code license today. So the source available licenses do that. Because they are frictionless, they allow people to easily download the software, play with it. It means you don't have to sign evaluation licenses with people and so forth. So it takes a lot of the friction out of the sales process. But it has a restriction that, if properly drafted, is narrowly crafted to protect the business of the company. And often that would be, say, you can use this for anything you want, but don't set up a competing cloud service that consists of the software. So that means the company can protect its cloud business, which is how it's making money and how it's funding the development of the product. So the free stuff, or the free aspects, help the community and the company, and then the restrictions help the company fund the free aspects. That's the way it's supposed to work.
Great. Well, that is all the time we have for today. I know there were a number of questions that folks submitted that we weren't able to get to. Our apologies. Do feel free to reach out, though. Like I said, we will be contacting you, and you can reply or reach out to us using the contact information on this page. So with that, thank you so much to everyone who took time out of their day to be here. And thank you for the wonderful questions. I think there was some really interesting conversation, even above and beyond the content of the webinar slides themselves. And of course, thank you so much, Heather. This was extremely informative and enlightening, and just really appreciate you sharing all of your insight and taking the time to be here.
Thanks so much. And thanks to everybody who kindly listened during this time. Have a wonderful day.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.